One thing that I've learned from teaching multicultural education in a variety of different contexts and places is that no two classes are the same. And it's really important for the professor or the teacher to really, well, in any class, but particularly in a class with what I deem unsafe content, such as multicultural education, it's really important for professors to learn their students so that they can understand where they are in their thinking, what they feel comfortable with, and what they might resist. These are some examples of the texts I have used throughout the years that I find to be transformational for students. Two in particular I'd like to talk about. One is sort of a classic educational text by Herbert Cole. It's called I Won't Learn From You. It was published in 1994. And it's sort of a non-threatening way to start the class of multicultural education because it doesn't talk about race in an explicit way, which many of my students, undergraduate students in a predominantly white institution, are sort of resistant to having those conversations at first. And Cole talks about the concept of not learning, which is a concept that really resonates with students. And it's the idea that if a teacher does not respect the identity of a student, then that student can choose consciously or unconsciously not to learn from that person. And that can easily translate into issues of racial identity, gender identity, sexual identity, etc. After reading Herbert Cole's book, I Won't Learn From You, a concept that really resonated with me was the notion of not learning. After reading the book, I realized that in 7th grade, I actively chose not to learn from my geography teacher, who I felt was not respectful to who I was as a person. And I didn't realize it till I read Cole's book exactly what this phenomenon was and why I was so resistant to learning from this teacher. And I think that concept is really important to impart to students who are in multicultural classes. It's important for teachers to respect the identities of their students. If not, students can choose not to learn from them. The next book I want to talk about is called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Beverly Tatum. And I think a lot of educators are troubled when they see self-segregation based upon race in their classrooms, in their hallways, in their cafeterias. And what Tatum examines is the racial identity development scale, indicating that when students experience issues such as racism, it's safer for them to sort of gravitate to people who have had similar experiences. And so using this book and using the racial identity development scale really gives students an idea, particularly as the Cole text, particularly students in predominantly white institutions, and we know 84% of our teachers are white, so it's important for us to have these conversations. It helps students understand the racial issues that they themselves may not experience as white students and white teachers. I have devised 4 main strategies for teaching multicultural education that I'd like to share with you. When teaching multicultural education, it's very crucial that students are not only reading texts about diversity, but they are seeing films, they're attending events, they're interacting with diverse people different from them. It's really important to hit students from all angles. Reflection is another concept that's very important. It's important for students to sort of reflect on their own. Changing mindsets doesn't happen overnight. It's an ongoing process. So it's important for students to take the time individually to critically reflect on their experiences, on their feelings, on their resistance. And oftentimes I ask students to communicate with me anonymously on how they're feeling and what they're struggling with in the class. And that allows me to sort of retool things and take a pause and do check-ins with students, because it's really important for students to get in touch with their feelings and to think about the reasons why they're having these emotional reactions to the content. So it's important that we address student resistance to thinking about the isms in our society, because it's easier and more comfortable not to address these things. So resistance is normal, anger and guilt can be normal, and it's important for students to think about and reflect on those feelings. The second strategy that I find crucial when teaching multicultural education is the use of simulations. Bafa is a complex simulation that I have used with undergraduate populations, master's level students, and doctoral students. So it's very effective for various populations. Bafa is a cross-cultural experiment which involves separating participants into two groups and then teaching them the rules, norms, and language of their respective cultures. Participants then attempt to observe and ultimately participate in the other quote-unquote culture, stepping from their comfort zones. Participants ultimately place their experiences in context and apply them to broader cultural issues.
So many students enter high school or university and they have this sense of shock, and it differs from their past experiences, and they really don't know how to handle this shock, or they don't know what to do with it or where to direct it. So oftentimes this shock kind of turns into generalizations or stereotypes or racism and sexism even. By physically putting themselves into a simulation like Bafa, they're learning how to appropriately and effectively handle their shock.
By being a facilitator for the Bafa simulation, I've come to see a very wide range of responses from those that take part in this simulation, whether it's overcome with emotion, possibly tears, or even just having a sense of true realization about themselves. This simulation in particular, I feel, is truly beneficial, for it allows participants to realize that we live in a very diverse world. We all have very big differences, whether it is through race, culture, language, or even sexual orientation. And all the biggest takeaway, though, is that it allows participants to realize that there's not just their way of living. There are many different forms of living in this amazing world that we have. And they must educate themselves and expand their knowledge in order to truly function in this world.
Bafa was a great simulation of how systems have cultural or dominant cultural norms within them, and then how frustrating and difficult that can be, which in retrospect we can find some of those same frustrations within the classroom, because we have dominant cultural norms in the classroom that our students have to be able to adjust or somehow acclimate to.
The third strategy that I use when teaching multicultural education is service learning. Service learning is a pedagogical technique through which students can learn to develop academic and social skills by actively participating in self- or class-generated projects for the betterment of the school and/or the community. Service learning extends the curricular goals of the class and broadens them outside the classroom walls.
As a student in Dr. Martin's Multicultural Education course, we were to create our own service learning project, which later became the Bravery Fair, which was a traveling interactive classroom based on teaching about various forms of oppression that we brought to a middle school, high school, and college.
Service learning for me was definitely a new concept, and it was something that I took a lot of positive feedback from. It personally impacted me on a lot of different levels, and it was really great to be a part of a group that was collaborating and working towards one goal. And honestly, by the end of it, I felt kind of shortchanged, just because it was the first time, like my sophomore year of college was the first time that I had gotten to really be a part of a service learning project.
Service learning for me taught me a lot of the things that you need to know when you go into your actual teaching experience, but you don't get taught in a class.
Service learning also showed us what we should be doing as teachers. We taught things that aren't taught in the new Common Core standards, but there's still things that are just as important to growing up as a middle schooler or a high schooler. Service learning is something that we'll all definitely implement in our classroom.
The fourth strategy that I use when teaching multicultural education is case study pedagogy.
You to read the case, socioeconomic status and student opportunity, a case of disrespect or teenage rebellion. Some of the basic facts of the case.
The Cambridge area in Pennsylvania, it was lacking in population and funding.
So what was a problem occurring in the school district that the administrators were trying to solve?
Well, it talks about that there were a lot of gangs, outside of the school. So that's why they created the summer program to essentially keep the students out of trouble.
I think she should go back and survey the kids in the past. Yeah. Fill in the major facts of the case. What is the major conflict of the case? What is the resolution? In an ideal world, how would you resolve this case if you could? What's the ideal resolution here? What's the theme of the case? I want you to make connections from this case or from what results from your discussion to something else we've read, we've talked about, we've learned in here.
I have taught multicultural education in a face-to-face format, in a blended model, face-to-face mixed with online, and in a fully online format. When teaching unsafe content like multicultural education, particularly in a blended or fully online environment, tech tools become very important. One must move beyond the traditional learning management system. I have found a couple of tools have been very beneficial. One is Poll Everywhere, and this is where you can create a poll and ask a question of your students, and in real time, students can vote through text, and you can get the results of the poll anonymously. So you can ask controversial questions that students might be hesitant to weigh in on if they have to raise their hands. But when done in an anonymous manner, students might tend to be more honest. When teaching fully online, VoiceThread is a very beneficial tool because it can be used asynchronously. Students can respond to lectures or prompts posted by the professor by sharing audio or video comments, thus bridging the gulf of anonymity that is often online learning. Creating a Twitter hashtag is another way in which students can communicate, connect, and share information. My plan is to continue to experiment with different pedagogical techniques and with new technologies to better enable me to deliver this content. Thank you for watching.